Okay, so the new Poison Creeper aspect is actually really nice. It goes really well with Cage Heart of Pekana and Cage Heart of Inexorable Force. So the current gameplay is from tier 2 and I'm pretty much smashing through it. Build is fairly tanky too due to it being mainly earth, since it has a lot of ways to generate fortify. And the really good thing about this build is you get subterranean aspect very early on. I believe we get it right after finishing the first journey, and right after you unlock that you can apply it to any gear at the occultist. So you can start making this build work really early on, and you really only need that aspect while leveling. And the next important thing for the build is the boons such as Pack Leader that you will need to make Poison Creeper reset, but you get that early on as well when you hit about level 15 on your Druid, and you get the malignant hearts that you need for the build sparingly too. Anyway, let's go over the skills and gear for the build, and after that we will go over how all of them come together to make this build work. So for this build, our basic attack is going to be Storm Strike, and of course our core skill is Landslide. So we're essentially taking Storm Strike for its damage reduction and its passive Fierce Storm Strike, 50% chance to make enemies vulnerable, but mainly also because we want to proc Resonance. If an Earth skill is cast after Storm skill, it does 18% increased damage at full ranks. So that's mainly why we're taking Storm Strike. And of course for Landslide, we're taking Primal Landslide as the passive. Whenever you immobilize or stun, we gain Terror Modes. When we have Terror Modes, our Landslide crits and also does additional critical strike damage. And in order to make Landslide better, in our passive skill points, we're going to be taking Walled Impulses. Core skills cost more spirit, but we do increase damage. And we're taking all 9 points in all the Earth passive skills. All 3 points in Crushing Earth. Earth skills does increase damage to slow, stun, immobilize. And we immobilize every time we use Poison Creeper active, and we stun every time whenever we use Petrify. And then we take all 3 points in Stone Guard because we will have Fortify up most of the time. And Earth skills does 12% increased damage. And to generate that Fortify, we take all 3 points in Safeguard. Since we will be critting a lot with Terror Modes, it's gonna really help keep up the Fortify. And to further increase Landslide's damage, we are going to take Defiance. It's just for elites and bosses, more magic damage. And then we're going to take all 3 points in Natural Disaster. Earth skills does increase damage to vulnerable, and we have 2 ways of doing vulnerable from our basic attack and hurricane. And of course, as I mentioned before, we're going to take resonance, 18% increased damage if we use a storm ability first, which will most of the time be Storm Strike. And for our defensive skill, we're taking Earthen Bulwark. And for me, I'm only putting 1 skill point into Bulwark's passive, which is Enhanced Earthen Bulwark, which makes you unstoppable. You definitely need this. And of course, for the main part of the build, we take Poison Creeper, and then we pick up Enhanced Poison Creeper and also picking up Brutal Poison Creeper. Your critical strike chance is increased by 20% against enemies that are strangled by Poison Creeper. And since Poison Creeper will cast Landslide every time it is activated, all the other passives we have taken to boost Landslide's damage will apply to Poison Creeper when enemies get hit by one of the Landslides that Poison Creeper activates. And then for our second last skill, we're taking Hurricane, and we're picking up Natural Hurricane, 15% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds. And then for our ultimate skill, we're taking Petrify. This is also important for the build, since we will need this to activate Inexorable Malignant Heart. And that's all the main skills for the build. And of course our key passive is Nature's Fury. I guess you could take Earthen Might if you also liked. That should also work with the build, but I went with Nature's Fury. I guess it's just more fun. So for our Spirit Boons, we're taking Weariness, reduce damage from elites. We're taking Sight Talons, Avian Wrath for critical strike damage. Then Pack Leader, which is a must since we need it to reset the cooldown of Poison Creeper active. And then finally we're taking Calm Before the Storm in order to lower the cooldown of Petrify. And in this build, I'm just going to include 2 aspects that I'm using, because honestly it is really hard to keep up a lot of aspects when you're leveling up since you get new gear every time. So the only aspect that you need to keep up is Subterranean aspect, which gives Poison Creeper the ability to cast Landslides whenever you activate it, on top of which Earth skills deal increased damage to the poisoned enemies. The build is basically centered around this. And the second aspect I'm running with this build is Aspect of Retaliation. Core skills deal increased damage based on your Fortify, and I usually always have full Fortify, so it's like an easy aspect to keep up. And for the gear, you don't really need to min-max your leveling, and it'll be hard to min-max anyway. So I only have a few things selected on default builds, like helmet, maximum life, willpower. But the important things are, for your gloves, you want ranks to Landslide, critical strike chance, or critical strike damage with Earth skills. And another important thing is your weapon. You want core skill damage, critical strike damage, vulnerable damage for sure. Even though they nerf vulnerable damage, is still really good, I think. Unless they nerf it by another 40%, I'm still taking vulnerable damage because it's in its own damage bucket still. But yeah, I won't go too much into gear. You can check it out in my default builds. For the gems, I'm going Emerald, critical strike, damage to vulnerable. For armor, we have a ton of fortify, so damage reduction while fortified. So we are going with Sapphire. And as I mentioned before, we are going with the Picana Malignant Heart. Inexorable Force, this one is important since it'll clump up all the enemies so we can use Landslide on them. And for the third heart, I went with Revenge. Went with a little defense for the third one. The weakest part of Landslide and even Poison Creeper a bit is its short AoE range, especially Landslide. So this is where Inexorable Force comes in. Whenever we use Petrify, all the enemies are stacked on each other very neatly for us, where usually one Landslide can hit all of them. So we Petrify first and activate Poison Creeper. If we get a reset on Poison Creeper, great, we just keep spamming that. If not, we can finish whatever's left with Landslide. And another bonus of using the Nature Fury's key passive is that sometimes Cataclysm procs whenever we use Petrify. Whenever that happens, the mobs will keep getting pulled in, since Inexorable Force states while you have an ultimate active. And while all this is going on, whenever we activate Poison Creeper, we get stacks of Terror Mode, and we use most of them within the Landslide of the Poison Creeper's active. So you are critting most of the mobs during that time. That's when Cage Heart of Picana is activated, and we do additional lightning damage to mobs since it is only activated when we crit. And before the mobs get pulled in, you activate Hurricane for good measure to make sure all the mobs are in a vulnerable state. But yeah, that's the basics of how this build is played. Hope you guys enjoy the build. I will have the link to default builds below, and I will have an update on the build when I start my capstones. And again, thank you guys so much for watching.